Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Dawn Soyoka. I'm the Congressional Papers Archivist here at the UH Manoa Library. That collection is a collection of the archives of many of Hawaii's post-statehood members of Congress. And it's a really good resource for studying politics in late 20th and early 21st century Hawaii. And since last year, we've been very fortunate to be able to offer a $5,000 annual fellowship to support a UH Manoa graduate student to do research in one or more of our congressional collections. And I'm very pleased to introduce Meagan Harden, who is our inaugural Hawaiʻi Congressional Papers Collection graduate student fellow. And I'll just kind of read her bio for you folks. Meagan is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her research explores American military imperialism in island spaces, focusing particularly on the reconfiguration of law and discourse in pursuit of territorial expansion. Meagan's dissertation project traces the consolidation of United States military in the former trust territory of the Pacific Islands, comprised of what are today the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia, and islander responses within international institutions. Other research interests include volumetrics, gendered politics of territoriality, and oceanic navigation practice. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Meagan. We'll have Meagan speak to us for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and we'll close up at 2. So again, thank you very much for being here, and welcome, Meagan.
Great, thanks, Dawn. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to share some of what I've been working on in the Hawaiʻi Congressional Papers Archives. As Dawn mentioned, I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography and Environment, and I'm actually focusing not specifically on Hawaii, but rather on insular territories and insular places more broadly that have been impacted by American imperialism, American expansion, in different configurations over especially the 20th century, but that of course still have impact today in the present. So this is one chapter of my dissertation project that I'm working on, and I'm tentatively entitling it Oceanic Affinity, Appropriation, and Annexation in the 1965 Pacific State Proposal.
Can you go ahead and share your screen?
Oh, is it not shared?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Got it. That's okay?
Yeah.
All right. Let me just move this guy out of the way. Okay, so like I said, this is one working chapter of this dissertation. So especially if you have feedback at the end, I am more than happy to receive it as I move forward with this project. And before moving forward, I want to say a huge thank you to the Hawaiʻi Congressional Papers Collection, and then also to Dawn for their support of this project. When I was formulating this project and even considering applying for this fellowship, Dawn was exceptionally helpful in terms of pointing me to potential sources that might be helpful. And since I've received the fellowship and have been up in the archives, she's been so helpful at connecting me, directing me to good resources, providing feedback and talking story as I'm brainstorming through this project as well. So thank you so much, Dawn, for all of that support. It's been a lot of fun to get into the archives. So most of us, when we think of the United States, probably imagine this contiguous 48 states on the North American continent. For those of us living here in Hawaii and maybe folks in Alaska, we might also tack those 2 states on as part of the United States. But few, if any of us, would probably also include the insular territories that the US maintains today. So that's in the Pacific Ocean, American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And then in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. Even fewer of us, probably none, and certainly not me until I started getting into these archives, would also include the freely associated states and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which for about 50 years were part of the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. However, had this 1965 Pacific State Proposal that I'll be talking about today been successful, all of these islands included in the kind of dashed green line, with the exception of Guam, would have been included in the state of Hawaii, which at that time was newly incorporated as a state into the United States. So that this hypothetical addition of those islands into the state of Hawaii is going to be the focus of this presentation. Okay, so to provide an outline of the presentation, I'll start with an overview of this specific state proposal and some of the global and local politics that informed the proposal. I'll then talk about the motives, both the explicitly stated ones and some of the more subtle motives for the proposal, and then responses by various actors to the proposal. Ultimately, I'm going to start making this argument that this specific state proposal is an important, although entirely overlooked, attempt to kind of level uneven territorial statuses within the US imperial umbrella. I'll talk more about what that means momentarily. But at the same time, this proposal in terms of an anti-imperial or solidarity or equality-oriented project was kind of always doomed to fail because it was proposing the extension of this inherently hierarchical state system that is the United States system. Okay, so brief overview. This proposal was introduced into the US Senate in 1965 by Hawaii Senator Hiram L, who's pictured here. This is his August 1965 report from Washington. So this is what he sent out to all of his constituents and others. Hi, Kenji.
Okay.
And this proposal would annex that entire trust territory so that this set of islands pictured here into the state of Hawaii. So that's more than 2,000 islands, about 100 of which are inhabited at this time. And it's spread out over 3 million square miles of ocean. So it's a pretty vast ocean space full of very distinct peoples with very distinct cultural, political, social, environmental, economic histories that all would become part of the state of Hawaii. Of course, these islands today are not part of the state of Hawaii. This was an unsuccessful proposal, and actually it didn't make it very far, even in the Senate, as far as consideration goes. And yet, as I'll show in this presentation, I think it's a really important moment in history for us to consider some of the ambiguities and tensions in US insular policy, and to think about hypothetical archipelagos or legal archipelagos that might have happened, although of course ultimately did not. Okay, so some of the geopolitical, more global context for the specific state proposal. After World War II ended, the League of Nations Mandate Islands in the South Seas that had been for several years, for a couple of decades, had belonged to Japan. Those were all put under US administration under a political arrangement called the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. The purpose of this trust territory was, again, sanctioned by the United Nations, and its goal was to foster political, economic, social, and educational development, or quote unquote advancement, in the trust territory. Of course, this implies the need to develop and advance in ways that are problematic and paternalistic and rooted in all sorts of colonial histories, and we can talk about that at the end. But just for the sake of this presentation, the goal, the ideal situation was to foster this form of development. However, the Pacific Islands trusteeship was unique. There were 11 total trusteeships that the United Nations kind of handed out to various entities at the end of the World War II. And the trust territory of the Pacific Islands was the only strategic trusteeship. Basically, the strategic orientation meant that these global powers recognized or perceived this chain of islands as between the East and the USSR especially, and the West of the United States. And so they perceived this as having strategic importance for international security. They thought that maintaining particularly Western, and in this case, American control over this chain of islands would facilitate international stability and peace. That didn't quite work out as planned. And the trusteeship system itself, and especially the strategic trusteeship system, ended up being really problematic. Most of the trust territories, so the 10 others, were overseen by the Trusteeship Council. That's a council within the United Nations. But the strategic trusteeship was unique in that it was actually overseen by the Security Council because of the strategic importance that it had. Of course, the United States has a permanent seat on the Security Council, and this meant that it was able to kind of circumvent some of the oversight that otherwise would have occurred in the trust territory. This is not to imply that other trust territories had a necessarily great experience with their trusteeship powers, because that's certainly not the case. But just to point out that oversight for the trust territory of the Pacific Islands was even further constrained by the strategic setup of the political status. So during the period, the about 50 years of US administration, it's kind of characterized by, again, this lack of UN oversight, and then a really profound US disregard for the well-being of the island inhabitants and the islands themselves. So there's a lot of environmental destruction that goes on, nuclear testing in the Marco Islands being the most well-known example. And for this reason, and others, it has been nicknamed the Rust Territory as opposed to the Trust Territory. A lot of the infrastructural development that should have happened theoretically under this trusteeship arrangement did not happen. So that's some of the global context for this proposal. And here I've given a timeline of some of the important moments leading up to this Pacific State proposal in 1965. So the first thing that I want to highlight is this green dashed line that lasts from 1900 to 1959. This is the period in which Hawaii is an incorporated territory. I'll talk again, or I'll talk more about what an incorporated territory entails in the next slide or a couple of slides from now. But it's what I want to point out here is that this is an extended period of time, nearly 60 years of being in what ends up being a pretty ambiguous political status position. The next thing I'd like to point out is this UN Resolution 1514. So this was a United Nations resolution towards decolonization. The goal of this resolution was to create and provide paths for places that had been and were still colonized to achieve self-determination in whatever form that might take. So this is great. Theoretically, it also has problems because it outlines specific paths to decolonization. So specific channels that colonized places can take. So the kind of possibilities for decolonial or decolonized futures were always already constrained by this resolution. And because this resolution and the United Nations itself really rely on negotiations between entities, it often put people living in the trust territory, for example, in positions where they were kind of choosing the lesser evil. They still had to answer to the powers that were actively kind of colonizing them. So while this is great in theory and still has done important work towards decolonization and particularly political decolonization, I just want to emphasize that it was not perfect, and that kind of constrained option for self-determination does play a role also in the Pacific State proposal. And then the last thing to note here is this first Congress of Micronesia. So this was actually held in July of 1965, and the Pacific State proposal was introduced just 1 month later in August of 1965. The Congress of Micronesia is the local legislature of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. The United States administering authority had actually been pretty reluctant to allow this Congress to convene. The United States, for a variety of reasons at the federal level, at least, was interested in maintaining this territorial status of the Trust Territory. And so they envisioned this Congress of Micronesia as being kind of an extension of US interests. So they really expected the members, the locally elected members who were residents of the Trust Territory to go along with US interests. But this doesn't end up playing out. The first Congress, well, all of the Congresses of Micronesia ended up being actually really champions of self-determination in a variety of forms. That's not to say that all of the members agreed, because they certainly did not, and we'll see the fracturing of this Congress later on. But I do think it's interesting to point out that on the one hand, we have this convening of people from the Trust Territory who recognize their goal as, determining their own futures, their own political futures. And then just 1 month later, we have this proposal from a foreign entity to annex all of those islands into another foreign entity. So kind of a juxtaposition there that is important to note before moving forward too. Okay, so here I've given a kind of hierarchy of political statuses, and this is US specific. This is also oversimplified, so just be aware that this is a very simplified version of how US insular policy works. But generally speaking, US states kind of sit at the top of this hierarchy. So residents of states like Hawaii today, or California, or New York, have access to the full Constitution. The entire Constitution applies. The Bill of Rights that we all are familiar with is non-negotiable here, at least in theory. And then also residents of states have the right to vote in presidential elections. Our local state level elected officials have the right to vote in other forms. So there is full representation in the national legislature. This isn't all the case in other levels. So US territories that are incorporated. So during that almost 60-year period that I showed you on the timeline when Hawaii was an incorporated territory, the Constitution, most of the Constitution applies, but legislative representation is limited. So this means that, for example, during that 60-year period, what residents of Hawaii did not actually have the right to vote in presidential elections. Their senators, so Hiram Fong and Inouye, for this presentation, didn't have actually a vote in the National Congress. So this is kind of a constrained status with only partial rights even as American citizens. Below that, we have unincorporated territories. Those aren't as relevant to this proposal or to this presentation because at the time, the trust territory was kind of in this outside status and Hawaii was a newly incorporated state. But I do want to flag that this unincorporated territory status does exist. The Constitution applies very nebulously and ambiguously, and it kind of depends on specific Supreme Courts and specific political actors at the time. And today, all 5 of the inhabited territories of the United States, so the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, all fall into this unincorporated status. So that means that they don't have full constitutional rights. They don't have the right to vote in presidential elections. So even today, we've got very hierarchical political statuses between the United States state and its territories. And then finally, I've included the trust territory here outside of this hierarchy because it was a United Nations political arrangement rather than specific to the United States. So it's not fully under that kind of US umbrella. Although, of course, the United States was the administering power, and although theoretically the trusteeship system and the UN Charter should have been kind of the equivalent of a Bill of Rights, they should have, outlined what rights these residents of the trust territory had access to. For the reasons that I mentioned previously with the strategic trusteeship, that ended up also not being the case. So when the specific state proposal is proposed, it is in part a response to the recognition that these are hierarchical statuses without full constitutional rights and protections afforded to all inhabitants of the United States and in the trust territory. So as far as kind of a theoretical framework for this project goes, I'm looking at it through the frame of regional connections and disconnections. So I draw on a few different scholars from actually quite different disciplines. So Antonio Benitez Rojo is, I think, a literature scholar, but he has this idea of repeating islands. He's primarily talking about Spain and Great Britain colonizing places in the Caribbean. But the point of his, or the kind of meat of his repeating islands concept is that colonial powers have basically a cookie cutter idea of political infrastructure, of rights, and of how colonization should look. And they impose that on places. Of course, despite the kind of uniformity of the imposition, colonization looks different in every place because there are local populations who have their own deep histories, who have their own institutions and relationships and social settings. So kind of the meat of, or the gist of that repeating islands concept is that, colonization is imperfect in practice and there's these distinctions remain. And I put this in conversation with American studies scholar Lanny Thompson's idea of an imperial archipelago. Lanny Thompson is talking specifically about US military imperialism and especially US military imperialism in island spaces. And so what he says is that all of these places where the United States constructs military bases, where they take land from indigenous populations, where they, like the trust territory, where they claim chunks of land for their military and strategic purposes, all of these have a relationship to the United States and become kind of anchored into the United States political system. At the same time, though, even though places are distinct and have their own experiences, because they're anchored to the United States, they also have connections to one another. And there's subversive potential in these connections that occur between places, and particularly between islands that have experienced American militarism. And then I put this further into conversation with geographer Sasha Davis, who proposes this idea of affinity geopolitics. And so this is similar in the idea that he's recognizing that there are affinities between places that have experienced militarism because the idea of repeating militarisms and repeating islands is imposed, but also recognizes that because those relationships exist, similar to the imperial archipelago idea, there are potential channels for solidarity and ways of uniting to become meaningful and to become agentive and to actually steer geopolitical formulations. So this is the idea that, even quote unquote small islands can actually play a major role in global geopolitics, particularly if they unite against, in this case, the United States. And so here I'm using these frameworks to kind of think of the Pacific State Proposal as the formulation or the articulation of a legal archipelago, of course, just a hypothetical one since it never fully materialized. But then again, thinking through the ways that this was then constrained because it was an extension of the United States. Okay, so I'm going to go into just some brief backgrounds of the two senators who were steering this proposal. First is Inouye. So of course, he comes from an immigrant background, which I think probably plays into his positionality in this proposal. He was also a Democrat and served in the territorial house for 6 years. So prior to Hawaii statehood, served as a legislator. So he is, at least for 6 years, was familiar with the status of being an incorporated territory and some of the constraints that are imposed by that status. And he was actually a pretty tentative supporter of this 1965 Pacific State Proposal. He put his name on the proposal, but for reasons we can discuss maybe during the Q&A, I don't think he ever really wanted to see this come to fruition, which connects to a point I'll make later on. I keep saying that, it's all coming together eventually. But just, he kind of will take a backseat in this presentation because he wasn't really involved with the advancement of this proposal. But then we have Hiram Fong. So also has an immigrant background. He was a Republican, so a bit more unique in Hawaii, and he served for 14 years in the territorial house. So also a long time involved in this position as a legislator in an incorporated territory. And he is the self-declared man of the Pacific. So this Pacific orientation becomes a major part of his political identity. He ended up being very influential in creating the East-West Center, which we still have today, of course. And was the first person to kind of propose sending the Peace Corps to the Trust Territory. There's, of course, a lot to be said about paternalism and all of these problems associated with the Peace Corps and with other entities going into places like the Trust Territory. But at least for Hiram Fong, this idea of being somebody who was transoceanic, who was across the Pacific, was a really important political identity for him. And then some more geopolitical context. So of course, in 1965, we're kind of in the heart of the Cold War. This is a period of American expansion, not necessarily territorially. So by this point, the US borders were pretty much stable, although of course the Pacific State Proposal would have changed that. But certainly ideologically and economically, this is a period where America is really, really spreading its wings. The contest between democracy and communism is at the forefront of politicians' minds in particular. And again, because these islands are between the East and the West, there's this idea that they are a particularly salient place in which to ensure democracy comes to pass. There's also a global mood of decolonization, as I showed that resolution 1514, and there's a lot of impetus in the international community to decolonize the world. And so there's increasing pressure on the United States too. When this proposal was made, I think there were only 3 trust territories that remained in force out of the original 11. So other trust territories have started to, exercise self-determination, and their trusteeship powers have, started to facilitate that. Not so in the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. So this is also a period where, that pressure to decolonize is coming to the fore. And so all of that results in this need to resolve the trust territory of the Pacific Islands political status in whatever form that might take, whether that's becoming a state or a part of an existing state or maintaining a territorial status. There's a need to resolve it. And so as far as motives for this proposal go, we see regional relationships being coming up a lot in Hiram Fong's language. So Honolulu was actually the original seat of the Trust Territory government. It was later moved to Guam and then finally to Citing, but it started here. So there's already this kind of recognition or this assumption this political assumption that Hawaii is closer to the Trust Territory politically as well as geographically than the continental United States. And then Hiram Fong uses this language of pre-colonial connections. So he talks about voyaging histories that Micronesians and Hawaiians share. He talks about the ocean-centered societies that cut across these islands. And he couches this, or he compares his proposal to a proposal by Hawaiian King Kalakaua. So Kalakaua had proposed this Polynesian League. This was a recognition that there were, encroaching colonial powers in Oceania, and the desire to, unite Pacific Islanders against those powers. And Hiram Fong takes this and runs with it and says, hey, this is what we're doing. Of course, it's not what they're doing. There's a very profound difference between uniting against colonial powers and extending the colonial power into the Pacific Islands. But this is the rhetoric that Hiram Fong uses. And I zoomed in here on a quote that I'll read. So this is from Hiram Fong's justification for the proposal that gets published in the congressional record. So Fong states that remembered as a merry monarch, the vision of this ruler, meaning Kalakaua, was not motivated by any grandiose scheme of aggrandizement, nor by any covetousness for Lebensraum or living space, a place to colonize, but rather by Kalakaua's genuine concern for the plight of the peoples of the Pacific and the modern world. So again, these are very, very, very starkly different things. This is the language that the proposal gets couched in. Then let me see if I actually zoomed in on this one. Yes, I did, great. He goes on to say, the plan which I, Hiram Fong, now advance, however, differs from that of Kalakaua in several important respects. While Kalakaua's plan would have united these areas under a monarchy, the instant plan would unite the Pacific Islands under a plan, the central feature of which is democratic representation and popular sovereignty. Love the chuckles, thank you. Yes, this is wild, this is crazy, right? Obviously, I hope we can think of the United States as an empire for a lot of reasons. One of the kind of core definitions of imperialism that I rely on is the idea of imperialism consisting of hierarchical citizenship statuses. So having some people who have fewer rights than others, which of course, as I've discussed, is the United States at this point in time and in the present day as well. So again, extremely problematic. As I mentioned, Hiram Fong is also, he doesn't have Kanaka Ōiwi heritage. He's not a Hawaiian. He's the son of Chinese settlers in Hawaii. So claiming this shared ancestry and claiming these historic connections are appropriating, right? At the same time, this is not to justify it. At the same time, there is not the same motivation of resources extraction, of explicitly or only strategic interests in this proposal. So it's complicated, is my point. And along those lines, one of the kind of big drivers of this proposal is also to raise awareness of the experiences of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. So this is, again, a period where the Trust Territory has been largely overlooked by the United States. Quite strategically, I think it was beneficial for the United States or for the American public to be ignorant of the fact that people's homes were being destroyed by nuclear weapons, that people were being experimented on by exposure to radiation. It's strategic for the United States at a federal level to ignore this Trust Territory. And Hiram Fong wants to work against that. He sees that as a problem, again, connecting to his identity as a man of the Pacific. So I'll just read a few quotes that I've found in correspondence in the archives. So first, this quote is a letter that he wrote to one of the representatives of the Congress of Micronesia. And Fong says, I am amazed and gratified by the great amount of attention that has been drawn to the people and problems of the Trust Territory. If my efforts do no more than to generate serious thinking about the future status of the Trust Territory, I will feel rewarded. So at least ostensibly, there's this interest in raising awareness. There's also a letter that he writes to the Vice Chancellor of the East-West Center at the time. And he says that it's evident that a great deal of public education will probably be necessary to acquaint more Americans with the peoples and problems of Micronesia. So again, a recognition that this is a place and a group of peoples that have been really overlooked by the power that is supposed to be supporting their self-determination. And this leads me to believe, not at all to dismiss the more imperial and really deeply problematic aspects of this proposal. I think, though, there is also an impetus to introduce something that is so audacious in terms of annexing an entire set of islands into a state of Hawaii, something that is so audacious that it gets people to pay attention. Before proposing this, Hiram Fong hadn't done really any research in terms of what the economic implications would be, what the path or what the political processes to facilitate the specific state proposal would be. He also reiterates several times that, this has to be the Hawaiian people, meaning residents of Hawaii, not necessarily Native Hawaiians, meaning the people of the state of Hawaii, and then also the residents of the Trust Territory would need to vote on this to determine whether this is a viable option. But he introduces it into the Senate in 1965 before any of that, and stating all of that, which leads me to believe that this is also an attempt to garner awareness. And in that sense, this proposal is relatively successful. So residents of not just Hawaii, but across the United States start sending in news clippings that have been published in their hometowns, start sending in their feedback to Hiram Fong. So we get pieces from Hawaii, but from also Illinois, Washington State, Washington, DC, all across the US, giving their perspectives. Some are very adamantly proponents of this, and some are very adamantly not. But there is a growing awareness. Oh, forgot to breathe there for a while. And then I think a secondary and perhaps even more powerful motive of this proposal was to mitigate that unequal status of insular territories. So if we think back to that pyramid that I showed at the start of this presentation, there are profound inequalities and legal inequalities between states, territories of both incorporated and unincorporated statuses, and then of course the Trust Territory. Alongside that, there come economic differences. So places that are not states are seen as risky to invest in, which also has its own pros and cons. We can get into that later. And then of course, the political and social inequalities. And this leads to a language of second-class citizens. I'm sorry, the F seems to have gotten lost behind the arrow. But frequently throughout the proposal and then through correspondence and discussions surrounding this proposal, we see this language of second-class citizens come to the forefront. And that's basically referring to the idea that as residents of an incorporated territory or a trust territory, we're not full citizens. We're not citizens in the same way that residents of a state are, and that's unfair. So here's one quote from that. Actually, this came from a resident of Honolulu writing into Hiram Fong in response to his request for feedback. And this constituent says that not too long ago, Hawaii's people were second-class citizens with no real vote in the national legislature, no vote in the presidential elections, and subject to taxation without representation. And then again, writing to one of the members of the Congress of Micronesia, Hiram Fong says that one of the chief purposes of my resolution in the Senate, looking toward the future incorporation of the Trust Territory into the state of Hawaii, is to offer first-class American citizenship to the people of the Trust Territory. Including the Trust Territory in the state of Hawaii is, in my opinion, the fastest means of granting first-class citizenship to the people of Micronesia. So there's this sense of urgency to resolve this political status, and more importantly, to resolve this uneven legal access to the Constitution, again, in Fong's perspective. And then this is another response. Sorry, it's quite blurry. But this is a response to another constituent who wrote in to say, like, hey, this is manifest destiny all over again. Like, this is not okay. This is imperialism. And Hiram Fong says that my proposal does not seek to impose on anyone a form of government they do not wish to have. Quite the contrary, it's intended to offer the people of the Trust Territory an opportunity to be included in the state of Hawaii as first-class American citizens. If they do not wish to become affiliated with Hawaii, my proposal, of course, cannot be implemented, for the resolution I've introduced in the Senate specifically states that the incorporation proposal must, as a prerequisite, be favored not only by the people of the Trust Territory, but also by the people of Hawaii. So again, he's emphasizing that this is a hypothetical proposal. Again, I think the real goal of this proposal is not to successfully annex the Trust Territory into the state of Hawaii. I think it's to raise awareness and ultimately to get people to recognize that these are unequal statuses. So in some ways, he's very pro-US, pro-democracy, thinks that the US is a democracy. At the same time, he's very clearly aware of the fact that it's not for everybody. So really embodying this kind of ambiguous, kind of contradictory positionality. And then as far as responses to the proposal goes, so as I mentioned, it was first proposed by Hiram Fong and Inouye. The US Virgin Islands representatives quickly jumped onto that. makes sense at this time and still today. The Virgin Islands are an unincorporated territory, which means that they also don't have a clear and immediate path to statehood like incorporated territories tend to. Alaska representatives were also supportive, so maybe a similar position in terms of experience with unincorporated and unincorporated territory status. Texas jumps on. I'm not really sure what's going on there. Texas does Texas things and is apparently like pro annexation and secession, and I'm not sure there. I don't know. At least in this set of archives in the Congressional Papers Collection, I have yet to find any correspondence or input from the departments that we would expect to have feelings or opinions about this proposal, such as the Departments of Interior, State, and Defense. So far, I haven't found anything by them in this set of archives. I do have hypotheses about that. At this period of time, the federal government was pretty pro territorial status into perpetuity for the trust territory. There wasn't, they weren't too eager to resolve this political status in the same way that Hiram Fong seems to be. And I think by treating it as a legitimate proposal, they might have been, treating it as a legitimate proposal and saying that this is actually a possibility. I think that would probably run counter to their political prerogatives at the time. Although this summer I'm hoping to go to the National Archives in College Park and maybe we'll find some more internal documents or conversations surrounding the proposal. And then from constituents, there's a very mixed set of both support and opposition to the proposal. So many people who write in say, this is a great idea. There's so many resources there. We can get those in the state of Hawaii and we'll become the greatest, biggest, richest state in the union. That's awesome. Others think of it as a potential economic burden. So they say, we're going to get stuck dealing with the infrastructure, dealing with the economic needs of this trust territory. So there's kind of an economic focus in both in support and opposition. There's also pretty frequent, again, reference to this memory of being second-class citizens. So again, it's only 6 years after Hawaii statehood. So this memory of having, being part of the United States, but also in some ways just belonging to the United States and not actually having the full rights that go alongside citizenship, again, at least theoretically. And then what's really interesting to me is that writing in, various constituents end up conflating all of the US insular territories. This proposal was specific to the trust territory of the Pacific Islands, but when people start writing in, they say, hey, it would be awesome if we included Guam and the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and all of these other places into the state of Hawaii. It would be terrible if we included Guam and Puerto Rico and American Samoa and all of these places into the state of Hawaii. So they have really strong opinions about whether it's good or bad, but they tend to lump all of these places together, which I think is really interesting. We saw in these kind of regional relationships language that Hiram Fong uses, we saw this emphasis on geographical proximity and affinity. And in the constituent responses, we really come away from that. The geographical affinities aren't there so much, and it's more based on these legal statuses, and also probably the assumption that all islands are the same, because that is very much present in the popular kind of geopolitical language surrounding islands and political statuses. Forgot to breathe again. Okay. And then the Congress of Micronesia. So again, this is the local legislative body of the trust territory of the Pacific Islands that the United States expected to be kind of an instrument of American interests, but which in reality ended up being a very, a quite powerful entity towards self-determination in various forms. So Hiram Fong writes to 30 Congress of Micronesia representatives. Remember, they had met just for the first time just a month before this proposal. Here it's to about 30 of them, asking for their feedback on this proposal, and gets 2 responses, at least what I found in the archives. However, those responses are pretty interesting in that they're very different. First, we have Benjamin Manglona, so he's pictured here on the bottom. He's from the Northern Mariana Islands, and he's very supportive. He thinks it would be a great idea. He thinks it's a fast way to resolve the quote unquote problem of the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. And he wants to be part of the American body politic. This is not so surprising, given that the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands eventually would vote just a decade later to become a permanent Commonwealth. That's again not to imply that everybody in the Northern Mariana Islands felt the same way, because they certainly did not. But at least at this specific level of the Congress of Micronesia, there was there was that movement to become permanently affiliated with the United States, and indeed this ended up happening. On the other hand, we get a response from Dwight Heine of the Marshall Islands. Dwight Heine is a staunch advocate of Micronesian self-determination and eventually even of Marshallese independence. And his response is what I'm calling diplomatically unimpressed. I think he recognizes that he has a potential ally in Hiram Fong, who is the, again, self-declared man of the Pacific. So he sees somebody who has some interest in the trust territory. At the same time, he very certainly does not want to be a part of the state of Hawaii or a territory of the United States any longer. And so, sorry, this is kind of a last-minute edition of this quote. It's not beautifully formatted, but it is what it is. And so Dwight Heine of the Marshall Islands says that while none of us are in a position to predict with certainty the ultimate political status of Micronesia, I am sure that it is of the utmost importance to us that the people in the states know more and more about the people of Micronesia, their islands, and their problems. So again, we've got this recognition of the fact that these are peoples who have been super overlooked, who have been disregarded by the entity that is supposed to be supporting them, and a recognition that maybe potentially here in Hiram Fong and in the Hawaii state legislature, potentially there's a way to get more attention, to get more focus, and to be taken seriously as political agents in particular. So as far as outcomes go, of course, this did not advance very far in the Senate. I think it succeeded in being audacious enough to also get shut down pretty immediately. That being said, I do think that it, facilitated some level of broader awareness of the trust territory, and in particular of that uneven political status. And more materially, it prompted the 1967 Study Commission on the future political status of the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. So this Pacific state proposal kind of morphs into a study commission. So rather than saying, hey, we need to learn more about these places and annex them, it says, hey, we need to learn more about these places and see what they want, which is a much better approach. And this joint resolution does end up being relatively impactful. So it gains support from the Congress of Micronesia. There's lots of support coming in saying, yes, this is what we want. Yes, we want to begin working together and collaborating on potential political futures for the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. And then this also prompts future political status negotiations. So it started in 1969. The United States finally took seriously the Congress of Micronesia's call to begin actually articulating potential futures of the islands. So again, I think there's that goal of building awareness, even as this is like a deeply problematic and imperial proposal.
Question.
Yeah.
Who is Bingham, who introduced the resolution?
He is from the state of New York. So this is in the House of Representatives. Go ahead. And then I believe it's Fong and Inouye who introduced, I think they introduced together into the Senate, the same resolution. And then actually, wait, did I put it in here? Yes, and then in terrible quality, I'm so sorry, we get a Senate resolution in the Congress of Micronesia. So it says endorsing the intent and spirit of the House Joint Resolution in the U.S. Congress to establish a commission to study the future political status of the trust territory. So this is this is the House version of the resolution. There's also a Senate version, and then this is the Congress of Micronesia version, expressing support for this study commission. Okay, so implications and relevance. I'll just conclude pretty quickly with a few observations, and then we can have some time for Q&A, and I would love to hear your thoughts. But again, thinking of this as an imperial archipelago, we see the ways in which both the trust territory and the United States, and to some extent the Virgin Islands is kind of in the background in this proposal. We see the ways that they are anchored to this broader continental United States and the federal government of the US. We see these experiences of the legal infrastructure, which is inherently unequal and inherently imperial, particularly towards insular territories. And we see the disconnections that come as a result of this. So on the one hand, we see pretty profound appropriation, the co-optation of political unity-oriented movements like Kalakaau's Polynesian League. We see those being kind of co-opted for what is an undeniably colonial imperial pursuit. But we also see at the same time some connections, some recognition of shared experiences in terms of unequal statuses, in terms of hardships facing the United States. It's not problems for the United States, they are the face. And then this leads me to my kind of overarching question that I'm considering in this chapter, but also in the broader proposal, which is whether it's possible for the United States state system to be extended or utilized or manipulated in a way that actually eliminates geographic inequalities, particularly legal inequalities. And in short, no, it can't. This is an inherently hierarchical system. Of course, we know that the United States is founded on inequality. And extending, no matter how good the intentions, extending that system, I think we can see in this proposal, would have been deeply problematic. It would have prevented self-determination in very real ways. With the 1967 Study Commission, we see maybe a bit more of a responsive attempt to actually, prioritize self-determination coming out of the trust territory and prioritize those perspectives. Although even that, when the negotiations come to pass, the United States, because it has so much power internationally, because it had so many resources comparatively, really ended up steering these negotiations in a way, or at least attempting to steer the negotiations in a way that favored it. And today, with the compacts of reconciliation and the status of COFA nations in the United States, still pretty unequal. So I think that even the 67 Study Commission, which is a more responsive, maybe better way of going about envisioning political futures, still insufficient. And so I think that this, more broadly speaks to the importance of regional and grassroots-based affinity and solidarity. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you guys for listening. Appreciate it. And happy to take any questions or comments or thoughts or reading recommendations or anything like that.
Good question.
Yes.
Is that hierarchy, is that in the US Constitution unincorporated, or where did that come?
Yes, great question. It's from a set of early 20th century Supreme Court cases. Actually, they're collectively referred to as the insular cases. So this happened mostly starting in 1901, and then through like 1921 was the last one, although scholars disagree on when they technically ended. But these are the set of Supreme Court cases where the unincorporated and incorporated territory status come out. There's this Supreme Court Justice Edward White, who proposes the idea. And these cases are like so rooted in environmental determinism. They're repeatedly, even though they're like Supreme Court cases, we see this language of like, oh, these people will never fit into the United States because they're brown, or because they live in the tropics, or because all of these really racist tropes. So these insular cases that are still on the books, like they're still in place today, are the source of that conceptualization of different statuses. And it turns out typically incorporated territories become states. So that was Alaska and Hawaii are like the main examples of incorporated territories. And they're kind of on a clearer path to statehood, whereas unincorporated territories are not. They don't have that same clear trajectory towards statehood, which is why we have like unincorporated territories today. Not that all of those places necessarily want statehood, because certainly would not. We can look at Puerto Rico right now as an example of that. But there's not the same path towards resolution of that political status either.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what was the original purpose of the UN territorial treaty in the first place? Was it to kind of like see the power of, or maybe like the island power of the forces that had control for the Pacific in the first place, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. So, following World War I, a bunch of places went under various powers. So like the islands of Micronesia went under Japanese power as a League of Nations mandate. Of course, these are places that had been inhabited for thousands of years prior to this and colonized in various forms. But that League of Nations mandate, once World War II ended and Japan and Germany had both been defeated, they still had these colonies. And so the United Nations facilitated the trusteeship system as a way to basically take them out of Japanese hands and put them in the hands of, like you said, more Western, more allied powers.
The victors.
The victors, yes, that's a clear way to put it. Yes, exactly. So, I mean, ostensibly, the trust territory purpose is to facilitate self-government, but of course, that assumes that these places hadn't had self-government for years and years and years before colonization.
And why did the US have so much control over the UN territorial trust, over everybody else, like state or place?
Yeah, so the US, they only had the one trusteeship, so they had the territory of the Pacific Islands, and the Navy actually played a major role in steering the kind of construction of a strategic trusteeship. So all of the other 10 trusteeships were not strategic. The US trust territory of the Pacific Islands was, because the United States really wanted them for military bases. Because the United States had that permanent seat on the Security Council, they were able to say, like, well, you can't come in here and do your oversight business, your UN visiting missions that other trust territories had. They basically kept those visiting missions out by saying it was relevant to national and international security. So it's really just that language of security that gets used over and over and over again to keep oversight out.
I guess the US.
Yeah, this is a period really of increasing American hegemony, if we want to use the IR terms.
Yeah, no, good question. Meagan, what is your vision for kind of like solidarity across oceans, and what would that look like outside of a hierarchy? Like, how do you see that, or how do you envision?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have like a clear singular political path, but we just saw, I'm gonna blink on the name, but we just saw Pacific Island youth really leading this climate movement, getting actually a vote in their favor to implement real protections against climate injustices and against pollution. So I mean, that's one way that this has been occurring, although it's still, of course, limited in that it operates within or responds to this broader international state system, which is also quite hierarchical. I mean, I think Oceanian youth are really leading this fight in various ways. We see in Guam right now, there's quite a lot of solidarity movement between like Filipino residents and Chamorro people against the US military expansion there. Those seem to have been successful. Ideally, you know, about a decade ago-ish, I want to say, when the military buildup in Guam kind of revamped, it was in response to the Marine Corps base being pushed out of Okinawa and relocated to Guam. So clearly in Okinawa, there was success in mobilizing against the US military presence. So if that can be expanded again by building connections, maybe Royu and Kinji can talk about SPAM and various ways in which they're mobilizing against militarism across Oceania. I think, you know, invigorating those relationships and really committing to them, I think, is a way that this starts to happen by saying, well, hey, if you can't be on Okinawa, you also can't be on Guam, you also can't be a Pu'uloa, you also can't be wherever. So it's not a very clear, actionable answer, but I think there are like emergent movements and ones that have been going on. And I think if we can, you know, build that regional identity in particular, and perhaps even beyond regional to include places like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and other island spaces that have experienced militarism both from the US and other powers. I think that's where the answer lies, although I don't have a clear answer per se. Yeah, Kenji.
Go ahead and then I'll follow.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we'll comment and then a question.
Yeah.
I was thinking that the way you're talking about like, the kind of co-optation of Kalakawa's project and trying to say that he's doing something similar, which, as you said, you know, the appropriation. I think it's something interesting because I was just recently reading Reclaiming Kalakaua, Tiffany's book, right? And how Kalakaua was maligned, and that was part of the kind of trying to legitimize the overthrow, and then all leading up to it by saying they were unfit to lead. And it's funny that even as he's doing that co-optation, he is in a small way also kind of rehabilitating Kalakaua's reputation by saying, no, he was actually doing this to try and, you know, he was advocating for the well-being, I guess, of Pacific people. So it's like an interesting moment where there's like, through the kind of decades-long project of maligning the monarchy, there's this kind of like opening that comes out as he's doing this. I thought that was interesting. And then my question, kind of similar to Don's question, I guess just thinking about, you know, if you think there are any insights from this research when we're thinking about COPA now and all of, you know, the COPA citizens who are in Hawaii and kind of growing community of COPA citizens, and thinking about how there still is that need for that kind of raising awareness, and, you know, a lot of people still don't understand how it is that they're able just to come without visas and, you know, all of that. So I guess any thoughts you have on what more we can be doing now to try and yeah, you know, to kind of, like Don was saying, have those kind of build those affinities and connections, but specifically like here in Hawaii.
Yeah, I mean, we're all in an academic setting right now, right? So some of us, I know I'm a teacher, I teach multiple classes, and I try to make a point of assigning, well, talking about COPA generally, but the Civil Beat has a great collection of articles on Micronesia and on COPA and on some of the ongoing problems there. So as far as like awareness goes, I think bringing it into our everyday practices, whether we're educators or I don't know what other positions folks have, but they have to be conversations that keep happening. And then, yeah, I mean, it's tough because we are stuck in this state system, right? At least for now, at least for the immediate future. And that's also the system that is responsible for providing compensation to victims of nuclear testing, for facilitating welfare programs that COFA residents have access to. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a solution necessarily, but I think that you're right that it's awareness that has to happen. It's also, you know, finding ways if we're in this, I'm gonna like contradict myself now. If we're in this like state system, right, we need people who care about the former trust territory, who care about people in general to be also in positions of power. I don't have a better answer, but if you do, I'd love to hear it.
I don't think I do right now, but we
Okay.
can keep talking about it.
Great.
Yeah, I was thinking back to Hiram Fong's initiative, and I was wondering if you're familiar with the Solomon Report. If anybody in the room, I can't remember the date of the Solomon Report and whether that was before he wrote this or after he wrote this, which essentially said, it was a congressional report saying benign negligence or benign neglect of the island, just leave them alone. Don't worry about them, kind of thing, as long as we can control the area, the US can control the area. So sorry to you.
No, yeah, I think that was in the late 60s.
Okay,
So I think it would have been maybe just after this. I'm not certain.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that, but I think that's right. And that's kind of the report where they say we want to maintain this territorial status forever, right? Where they're not actually interested in
Yeah.
fulfilling those obligations with the trusteeship or with resolving the political status. Yeah, I think that was right afterwards, but
okay.
yeah.
I can't remember the date.
Yeah.
Maybe that was kind of his response if it came before
Sure.
to that and had other ideas, but it would have been good timing to do something completely opposite of what the Solomon Report was.
I think that the Solomon Report actually, I mean, I think it was written in the 60s, but I don't think it was like released publicly until like towards the 80s or 90s.
No, but I'm saying he would have seen it and
That's
it might have been
okay.
a response that he said, well, you know, blow that open.
1971.
When it was written or released?
Really? Yeah.
Released, okay. But yeah, you're right that he might have seen it beforehand. 'Cause it was released after the fact, I think. It wasn't never supposed to be publicly released. Inouye students actually like found it or somebody gave it to them and they publicized it, which is really. But yeah, I'm not sure when it was actually written. Yeah, me.
Thanks for this wonderful presentation. I wonder, because you mentioned one of the motivations that doing the proposal is to raise awareness. And I wonder in the archives or anywhere else, have you seen any kind of resulting or what kind of awareness has been raised? I work in the Jack Hilton paper, right? I mean, Jack Hilton raised so much awareness for the Marshallese, but the specific kind of awareness that's being raised, you know, saying, you know, the Marshallese are professional victims right now. They are victims and they're professional, they're asking money, etc. So I guess raising awareness, it's really depends on what kind of, so I'm wondering, like, have you found any of the details?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the kind of awareness that Hiram Fong at least is envisioning is awareness of, again, the discrepancies in statuses. So especially political and economic awareness in regards to that trust territory or to the UN Charter, where there are specific like goals or expectations that are outlined and obligations of the trusteeship power. And I think Hiram Fong is mostly saying, like, we're not doing this. We're not developing the infrastructure like we've said we would do. We're not promoting political development in the way we said that we would, because we're not actually even considering alternative political futures yet. So I think those are kind of the main forms of awareness that he's talking about, is getting people to recognize that there's this international institution obligation that the US hasn't met. Yeah.
There are 3 chats. Are any of those questions?
No.
Oh,
The chats are saying, no questions, great presentation.
Was a great presentation.
Thank you. The tricky thing to talk about, and I'm always really hesitant to qualify that I'm not saying this is a good proposal. I'm not like pro annexation in this sense. But I'm looking at it as like a moment where things get ambiguous. Like Kenji's saying, there are like really conflicting and contradictory elements going on. And I think that like sitting in those moments is really important if we're going to start envisioning alternative political futures and pursuing those in different ways. But would just like to qualify that I'm not in support of this proposal. That's not at all my.
Was it his idea or was it somebody lobbied him to submit?
I think it just came out of his back pocket. Like, this is something that we should do, as far as I've found, at least.
Part of his man of the Pacific shtick, but why did he, I guess, so that he would be fulfilling that role. But, it seems that he was so unprepared for all of the things that would, all the questions that would arise.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So he never really expected it would fly.
I don't think so.
anywhere.
I don't think he expected this to gain traction. He seems even surprised that people start talking about it. So I do wonder, yeah, maybe this is just a way of him to signal, hey, I care about y'all over there. I'm not certain. I'm also like, this is my first kind of foray into Hawaii statehood politics. But I still have a lot of reading and a lot of learning to do to flesh out some of that background, which I imagine would give more insight.
Well, chances are he was anticipating a re-election campaign or something, and he thought this would be good. No,
I mean, it seems like a fast way to get booted out. If he has no mean, it's not a great proposal.
yeah,
I don't know.
maybe he wanted to get out of it.
Yeah, maybe he was ready to retire.
I don't know.